Chapter 23 Delusions. What is this? The creature gestured with a single hooked claw, her stony eyes upbraiding Kentucky as if she were a disobedient child. Ember stared at her mouth, mesmerized. The words did not align with the movements of her lips. "Must you dishonor your beauty in this way?" she crooned, combing her fingers through her hair. "Why would the noble daughter of you naively cloak herself in the raiment of lesser beings?" He thought at first that the Sirena's speech was delayed, like an echo, but with each passing moment it became clearer that the words she spoke were entirely foreign to Ember. Too many rounded vowels, subtle throat movements, and tongue-against-teeth syllables. His intense curiosity as to whether this marvel of understanding was siren magic at work or the enchantments of the well was dampened as Kentucky swayed into his field of view, touching a small rip in the fabric of her trousers. She tugged anxiously at a loose thread, the muscles in her face pulling tighter. Less afraid of her now that he knew she could not see him, Ember curiously brushed his fingers against her arm. They passed through without effect. Everything here was as insubstantial as the servant of the oracles herself. "Surely you were not singing for your own pleasure?" Kentucky's voice was scarcely more than a breath. "Certainly not," murmured the red-haired Sirena, condescendingly, he thought. "My songs have purpose. Where is the unhappy traveler?" He was happier than he had ever been in his short, wretched life. "They always are, even until the end." The Sirena chortled. Ember shuddered. "You have come to partake of my spoils?" Kentucky took a small step back. "I would not think of it." "Sit," intoned the Sirena, her gaze narrowing. She pointed a single finger, hooked with a wicked black claw, to the opposite side of the fire and smiled. A cruel smile. A mockery. "Eat." Kentucky slunk forward like a beaten hound, sniffing and wrinkling her nose. Her batwing ears hung low, twitching at each bird call and crackling leaf. When she reached the other side, she lifted her head. "It is very strong smelling," she whined. "No man would eat this. You have put stinky weeds in this soup." Ember approached with caution, pausing every step to observe the illusion of Kentucky. Her mannerisms were quite different to his remembrance, even from the day she had peered fearfully out at him from one of his own fishing nets. There was no defiance, nor playfulness. A groveling sort of submission weakened her posture, which Ember found both distasteful and alarming. "Men have neither our tastes nor our appetites," sneered the Sirena, winding her fingers through her thick red mane. "Eat, Kively, eat." The name slipped from her tongue, soft and alluring. Deceptively so, Ember decided, for there was an undercurrent of threat, like a rumble of thunder from far off, and a dangerous glint in her coal black eyes. He slowly followed Kentucky to the other side of the fire, where he crouched on the leaves, or rather, upon the flagstones near the well, and kept his gaze firmly on her face. She paid him no mind. He did not exist, for all she knew, and he wondered what she would think if she knew he was watching them both. "I am not hungry," muttered Kentucky, pinching her lips together. That Ember did not believe. He had known her long enough to be sure she would never willingly turn down a proffered meal. Yet she knelt before the glowing embers, staring nervously into the pot. It was a lightweight utensil suitable for cooking meals on the road, and when he glanced round the clearing he noticed the edge of an empty blanket bunched against a tree trunk. Someone had very deliberately covered it with leaves, and the sight left a bitter taste in his mouth. "You were always hungry," murmured the other, dipping her fingers into the pot and hooking a bit of meat on the end of her claw. She popped it into her mouth and chewed, smirking. "Eat." "This is not." Kentucky hesitated, throat bobbing slightly as if she knew the words she wished to speak, but could not or dared not utter them. "This is not our nest. Let us leave at once." "We shall leave when I wish to leave." "Or have you forgotten that I am the elder?" The Sirena grinned at her, licking one fang. "Come, sup with me." At last Kentucky sniffed the stew again. "We will eat quickly," she relented. "Why hurry?" Her big black eyes darted around the clearing, and she held a hand over the stew pot. "I do not like it here. That is all." "HMMMM," said her sister, and though it was only a vision from a forest far away, the single note resonated throughout all his body with a power that transcended time. "As you say." Slipping into a more relaxed demeanor, Kentucky picked a bit of meat from the pot and chewed vigorously. Ember pressed a clenched fist into his stomach and scooted backward on the cold tiles, fighting the urge to be sick. It was impossible not to piece together what was happening, who this fierce woman was, and, worst of all, what was in the stew. Breath dribbled down her chin and her fangs flashed in the dying firelight, and she gulped down the accursed meat. He winced and glanced away. "Some of our clan have been wondering," murmured the sister, "about you." Kentucky ate faster. "Not I, of course, but others have." "You should not make yourself so scarce, sister. You have not been yourself since the heretic was slain." Through a full mouth, she confessed rather meekly, "I do not think he was a heretic." "Then perhaps you would do well not to think at all. What else would one call such a liar?" hissed Kentucky's sister. "His delusions would have sown dissent amongst our clan. False hopes, false stories. A false fish, he was." To that, Kentucky had no answer. "She did lie to me," was all Ember could think. "She lied. She lied." His fingers shook, but he clenched them around the knife and swallowed hard, glaring at them both in turns. His stomach churned, yet an acute interest in what was being debated kept him rooted to the ground. It was plain that he was hearing two sides of a many-faceted story, the complexities of which escaped him. But perhaps the well would reveal. His delusions were pleasing, Kentucky mumbled around a full mouth. "Did you not find them pleasing?" "Don't be such a half-wit," snapped the Serena, pouring another handful of stew into her gob and grinding her teeth together loudly. She flicked a bit of broth at Kentucky, who flinched. He was an elder, but a mad one, and he went awry in the end, like all the frail-minded fools before him. Fa! Hidden mountain kingdoms, men who know of magic. Only you could believe such a tale. Eat, and be satisfied. It is all you shall get from this one." Something, the words, the tone, made Kentucky stop chewing. She glanced up furtively. "This man," remarked the red-haired Serena, "did not fear me as he ought. Perhaps he had seen you lurking about, sister? You have been a shadow in these woodlands of late, have you not?" An expression of tightly controlled fear, which Ember remembered from their encounter with the book, passed over Kentucky's face. "I am sure, Sylvie," she said, swallowing visibly, her neck jerking like a bird's, "that you are mistaken. I keep to myself." "When you wish to," Sylvie murmured darkly. There was enough of a lull for Ember to pick apart the name. Kentucky's parting words on his doorstep had indicated that Vlee denoted family, or perhaps had something to do with the clan her sister had referenced. Syl must be this creature's given name. He wondered what that meant. Something vile, no doubt. We spoke for some time as he prepared his supper. What a shame he never got to taste it. All is not lost for us, however. He shall sate our appetites far better than the last bony wastrel you found, chortled Syl, digging her fingers into the pot. Besides, I think this shall make for a beautiful adornment when I attend your ceremony. Don't you? And she quietly reached into her tresses, twisting a strand which Ember now saw had been braided and looped around a tarnished silver ring. It flashed in the firelight. At this, Kentucky's head snapped up, as if someone had yanked her by the hair. "Oh, yes, we had a lovely conversation." Syl glowered from over the pot, her thin smile doing nothing to soften the expression. It chilled the marrow of his bones. His name, his profession, where he walked yesterday, and whom he hoped to meet tonight. He told me everything, you see. A shiver ran through Kentucky from her shoulders to her toes, which she curled and tucked beneath herself, retreating inward. "He did." She whimpered, her cheeks still bulging with stew. "He did." Syl stuck a finger in her mouth and sucked it thoughtfully, though Ember guessed it was only the pretense of recollection, and she was instead deciding which details would elicit the most entertaining reaction from her sister. Her eyes narrowed. "Bren was his name, I believe." No sooner had the words been spoken than Kentucky put out her tongue, the mouthful of stew sloping back into the pot. Syl's smile stilled. "You were going to present his body to the elders, weren't you? Your sentence is tomorrow. Certainly you weren't planning to show up empty-handed." A gentle hiccup echoed through the clearing and Kentucky's lower lip trembled for a moment. She covered her mouth with one hand, claws pricking her cheek. Syl laughed, a hollow laugh which rang out loud in the clearing with such delight that Ember could have killed her where she sat. The potent herbs with which she had flavored the stew, together with the floral musk of 2 Sirenas, must have made it difficult even for Kentucky to smell out her trickery. Bren. Now he had a name. Someone Kentucky had known, someone she had eaten. She had, it appeared, eaten many before him. He clenched the knife in his hand and watched, silent, sweating. What did you think to accomplish with this dalliance? I did warn you not to humor your prey. Men are senseless creatures, and my silly sister is all too easily led astray by mortal mischief. You might have laid claim to him beneath the crescent moon, and shared your rewards with the rest of us. Instead, you partook of our meager portions while we yet hungered. So licked her lips. An offense against our clan, which I have rightly remedied. Thank me, sister. Kentucky began to quake, body swaying like a leaf in a wind. Syl leaned over the fire as her lips peeled back in a snarl. Thank me, Kively. A guttural warning, verging on a growl. Thank me. Her quivering mouth formed soundless words. Louder, Kively. Thank you, hissed Kentucky, her face as pale as the oracle's bones. Now sit and eat the rest of this. After all these days you have waited for a taste, why waste a single bite? Kentucky fell still, white skin, wide eyes, bared fangs, and in that instant, Ember thought she would fly across the dying fire and tackle her sister. Instead, with a wounded trill that made his ears ache, she lurched away from the light and crawled through the decaying leaves, black hair dragging in the dirt. Come back, sister, crooned Syl, her gentle voice stopping Ember just as he was about to get up and follow. He glanced in her direction and witnessed the ghastliest change of face he had ever seen, her eyes rounded, tongue curled tightly against the roof of her mouth, fangs glinted in the light of the fire and moon, ears pricked beneath her thick red tresses. Be glad it was I who found you out, for the clan would have you disavowed for your transgressions. Kentucky retched, beating at her breast until much of the stew had been disgorged, and then drew in 3 sobbing breaths. Each movement was fraught with a desperation that tugged at Ember's soul. The final dregs of fear and disgust slipped from his fingers, and he could no longer find it within himself to hate with any ardor, to despise such a pathetic, stricken creature as she. He awkwardly shuffled across the flagstones, his heart in his mouth, but had not yet reached her side when she suddenly stood and sprinted for the edge of the clearing. Kively. The lullaby tones vanished, in their place a sharp command. Ember glanced over his shoulder. Syl had stood, the embers of the fire glowing near her bare feet, and pointed with an authority which cowed him where he knelt. Do not run away again. She purred, taking a single step, bloody mane flowing around her like water. Her eyes shimmered with malevolent intent. Come back, wayward sister of mine, and finish your penance. You know you cannot hide from me. Scrambling to his feet, Ember pulled in a deep breath. Until that moment he had not been aware he was holding it. Kentucky. He whispered. Her head lifted. A thrill swept down his spine as he wondered if she could hear him. Could it be that the well had so much power? Was he present, as a sort of ghost in this memory? Kentucky, run. He darted forward and collided, knee first, then his shoulder as he twisted in confusion, with a solid barrier. The wall. He pressed his hand against rough stone, breathing hard. Damn. Ember glanced back, careful not to make eye contact. Syl's bare feet slid through the leaves, red hair trailing, a leisurely pursuit. Run. He begged, pressing against the alcove wall. Kentucky. Can you hear me? She took a step. A low hum echoed behind him and Ember instinctively clapped his hands over his ears, screaming to drown out the sound. Run, Kentucky, run. With a piercing howl Kentucky sprinted into the woods, ducking through foliage and disappearing in darkness. A splash followed, the river. Footsteps crunched behind him and an earthy chuckle lifted the hair on the back of his neck. The forest glimmered faintly, alcove stone blinking through underneath. Ember stepped back, removing his hands from his ears. The trees rippled, pieces shifting and sliding, becoming unreal in odd patches. Soft moonlight stuttered into a sudden brightness, and he blinked, stunned. Morning light streamed through the trees, which were themselves altered in shape, more tangled and overgrown, and running down a steep slope, and then everything plunged into darkness again. The landscape twisted, blinking between starlight and sunshine. He glanced over his shoulder, baffled, and choked. Syl stood nose to nose with him. He scrambled backward, flagstones scraping underfoot. The light flickered again, rays of brightness alighting upon her tangle of hair, like a glowing crown. Something had shifted in her appearance. She stood close enough for him to note a few small scratches which had marked her brow, and her hair was now tangled with brambles and little twigs. Oh! The sirena licked one corner of her mouth. His knees went weak. How interesting! Her mouth matched the sentence. She no longer spoke in the siren tongue, but that of his own people. They were familiar words, half buried in a thick, tangled accent. When he tried to turn his head, those fell black eyes held him firmly in place. Panic tightened his throat. Am I really here? Or there? She can't see me. This is the past. Right? I know your voice, crooned the sirena, tilting her head. How came you to this place? And where is the dark-haired one? Ember's heart thrashed wildly. The well was broken. He had always been a fool, but now he had found a way to ruin time itself somehow. Would they be stuck here forever, together, in this warped unreality? The thought petrified him. Her sumptuous hair had been partly braided and looped about her neck and chest. Purplish juice trickled from the corners of her lips. Her fingers unfurled. A few smashed berries dropped to the mossy stone, as if she had recently been shoving them into her mouth. She reached out, narrowing her eyes, and grinned. Stay back, he managed, his throat drying out and his hands trembling. Don't touch me, her claws grazed the tip of his nose. And passed through. She wrinkled her nose and put out her tongue, swaying closer. To what name do you answer, little man? The forest snapped and bent, a few lingering stars gave way to the sunlight, and they no longer stood beside a dying fire but within that craggy clearing, surrounded by trees and cliffs. He put a hand to his head and squinted, dazzled by the sudden change. Don't know, he hadn't intended to speak. The sirena's voice drew the words from his chest. She laughed, and hummed a quiet melody beneath her breath. He recognized that laugh. He recognized the tune. Down, down to the sea we shall fly, down where the salt winds blow. This was real. This was now. No. Ember shouted, sprinting across the flagstones and slipping on a wet patch. Kentucky, his foot plunged down over empty space, struck the corner of a stone stair, and he tumbled headfirst through the loamy soil. The vision winked like a sputtering flame, and vanished. Ember lay in a heap at the bottom of the alcove stairs, arms outstretched, soaked through from head to toe. He had diverted the flow of water from the well, and it was trickling over the stones towards several books and scrolls. One of the heatless candles had been knocked over by his elbow, but it continued to glow unabated beneath the stream. Tears streaked his face, pulled from him by the shock of the encounter. He forced his gaze upward, half expecting to see the red-haired creature looming above him, but the alcove was empty. He could still see her black eyes boring into his skull. And Kentucky, he moaned. It seemed a cruel thing to Ember to have been brought so close to his former compatriot, only to have her stolen away again, just as he was beginning to feel she was real. Had she made it out of the mountain without him? Was she forever bound to the madness of the book, or did she, too, wonder what had become of him? Where is the dark-haired one? Those words must have been in reference to her sister. Had Kentucky been followed? If so, for how long, and had she known she was being chased? Ember staggered to his feet and limped back up the stairs to the well. Tell me how to find Kively, he cried, voice breaking, but the well had gone dark and even the sunlight was fading above him. You didn't finish. You can't be finished. Where do I go? The only sound was his own heavy breathing echoing around the alcove and the water trickling quietly through the room below. Where is the sirena who led me here? He tried, one last time. Please. He brushed a finger over the powdery dust of the bones, even sprinkling a little into the well, but no brilliant light danced on the water's surface. Several minutes crawled by in silence, until Ember felt that waiting on the fickle magic of this room any longer would be a pointless pastime. It occurred to him that he had overlooked his most obvious resource, the books. "Fool," he muttered. Huffing, he turned away from the well and took the stairs two at a time, darting back to the little room where he had left his shoes. He reached steps to the doorway, grasping the corner of it to swing up and around, and halted abruptly. The lady stood between the bed and the wash basin, hands behind her back. Her blonde brows drew together, and she lifted her chin. There was no more winsome smile, no warmth upon her face. Instead, a pair of cold blue eyes glowed brightly in the dimness. "What have you done?" Ember reached for his knife, but she flickered, her eyes accusing. A breath of wind stirred his hair and he shivered, grasping the back of his neck. Her voice whispered from nowhere, and everywhere. "Tell me, son of man, what have you done?" Chapter 24 Shattered Trail. Insatiable voices ravaged her mind. They descended like a flock of cackling crows, flapping and shouting and shrieking at her plight. From the bowels of the earth below her and the stale air above, pressing their songs against her delicate reasonings, that fragile nothing she had retreated behind, threatening to snap her sanity asunder. It would be a fitting fate, no less than she deserved. Perhaps now she would meet her own end, as she had so recently ended, forget. Sturdy stone voice, thrumming far underground. Voices of the water all around, yet nowhere to be found. Shrill beetle voices, droning on. Serpentine voices whispering through caverns far away. And all manner of confused echoes tangling together. Remnant spells dropped from dying lips, hasty enchantments flung through the halls like spider threads. This was sticky, rotting magic, oozing from every crack in the stone floor and each chip in the polished door. Its unsettling tenacity reminded her of the golden eyes which lurked in deep waters, reshaping their globulous bodies and serpentine arms with a single thought, that they might disappear into the stony ocean clefts, where even the hungriest siren dared not reach. And, once, she thought that someone called her name in the dark. Ember's voice. She knew it was only a memory, for there was no song, no heartbeat to accompany it. But that was worst of all, for it brought into sharp clarity the accursed pedestal, as if she stood there still, staring at the book. Forget. Forget. She wished she could devour the fractured spells so that they would cease their chattering, but there was no way to swallow such voices. They whispered unabated. Songs of the seas and the earth were familiar to her, but these were man-wrought and siren-wrought, echoes of the past which pressed against one another in a torrent of ceaseless whispers, awakening memories not her own and threatening to unravel her reasons. To shape her into something else. She shifted her cold hot feet beneath her and touched the cold hot wounds on her face. He had put them there, with his cruel words, no, the book had, and then she, forget. 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 Kentucky smacked her palm thrice into the blood-soaked floor. Her tongue was blistered. The corners of her mouth cracked with every wince. Each dry breath leached more water from her lungs. She would need to leave her refuge someday soon, to seek water. Seek water. But she did not get up from her place by the washstand with the broken basin, empty bottle, and the little ocean-tumbled shells. She had reached up to take one of those shells, longing for its familiar texture. It had crumbled to dust beneath her touch. This was the cavern where fewer voices scratched at her ears, yet it had hardly welcomed her. Home to a single bed, the wooden stand, and several alcoves along the low ceiling, sheltered by small wooden doors. She had explored them all with hunger-shaken fingers, but her efforts yielded only cracked dishes and a few small fragments of glowing stone. This place did not deign to provide her with a light, or perhaps it no longer had the capacity to do so. It was just as well. She preferred the darkness. It reminded her of the deep waters in ancient forest thickets where she had so often sought refuge. She licked the palms of her hands, wetting her cold hot face. Her misery knew no end. For now she would lie here, in the empty mountain nest of ancient men, all alone in the ageless dark, without so much as a single drop of water to wet her tongue. She should never have come here. Never have brought him here, forget. Kentucky dug her claws into her wounded feet, and cried out in anguish. The cry became a snarl, and she dug her claws in deeper. When her roving thoughts strayed too close to the face which had no name, or the things she had not done, or the reasons she had forgotten, she must direct them elsewhere. No matter the cost, no matter the misery. For the alternative, to dwell, to remember, was far, far worse a fate. Forget, Kentucky hissed, gathering fistfuls of her hair and tugging angrily. She curled over until her aching forehead rested on the stone, and closed her eyes. Forget. Forget. Maybe when she awakened, the voices would be gone. Maybe, when she awakened, forget. Tell me, son of man, what have you done? Ember hesitated for only half a breath, and then resumed his stride to the bed. Her fury gave him pause, but after so recently recovering from his frightful encounter with the well, he had little fear to spare for anything else which might dissuade him from his quest. Only what was necessary, he muttered. Maybe you could have helped me, but I can't stay here forever. I did what I had to do. I had to. Her low whisper came from all around him as he stooped to retrieve his shoes. You disturbed the oracle's bones and brought shame upon his resting place. Ember flinched, but he sat on the edge of the mattress, keeping one eye on the lady. I apologize. Are there any maps in your books? Any maps of this mountain in particular? I need one, urgently. Two brilliant blue eyes pierced him as he avoided her gaze, tugging on his shoes. How dare you ask me this? You have tarnished the legacy of man, and now you will make yourself a thief. Is it not enough that you have defiled my master and tricked his well? I'm certain he would have helped me if he'd been here, Ember murmured, surprised to find that he actually believed it. About the map, you desecrated our sanctuary, and you speak to me of books? Ember backed slowly toward the door, holding out one hand in a sign of peace and gripping his knife very tightly in the other. He would not be waylaid, but neither could he afford to offend the lady further and risk another magical setback. If you had trusted me, listened to me, maybe we could have found another way. Together. But you, trust? Her face contorted, blinking rapidly from peaceful apathy to a terrible fractured wrath, and back again, as if battling the bounds of the very enchantments which had shaped her. This is a place of refuge, a storehouse of knowledge. Have not the sirens cursed our halls and sacred rooms well enough without our own sons and daughters betraying the very cause for which they fight? There is no one else. There are thousands. There is no one else, Ember grumbled, sweeping out the door and appraising the stacks of books and scrolls. They are all dead. She was silent. He glanced over his shoulder and saw that she stood frozen with her mouth partly open, staring at the space where he had been standing several moments ago. A knot of remorse lodged in his chest, and at last he offered her a gentle shrug. There are no battles anymore. The war is over. We lost. Her ethereal form wavered in and out of view, like a star twinkling through tree needles. No one? Came the breathy sigh. The sanctuary suddenly seemed very empty. Ember glanced away again, his eyes alighting on a bundle of scrolls. None that I have met. If there are, I don't know how they could have survived in this place. I think your adversaries killed the men and women who lived here, or else drove them all away. No one has set foot in this mountain for hundreds of years. He gently nudged one of the books with the toe of his shoe, watching the candle atop it sway accordingly. The magic has all gone wild. I came here with my friend. And now we are trapped in here, and I'm trying to get out again. You see? With a faint crackle, the lady faded away to nothing. I see. Wait. You didn't tell me where to find the map. But she did not reappear, nor did she answer him from the shadows. All right. Ember frowned and ran a hand through his hair, making the tangles even worse as he scrunched his fingers. Well, there has to be one somewhere. And, as was his habit from his lonely days by the river, he fell back into talking to himself, muttering about things of little to no import as he sifted through the pile of scrolls near the bedroom steps. Poetry, useless poetry, the lot of it. He decided to clear one of the shelves and begin putting back all the tomes that did not meet his needs. He was in too much of a hurry to organize them, but he thought perhaps the despondent servant would appreciate his efforts, and it would at least keep him from confusedly re-reading the same pages and wasting time. His occasional murmurings, remarking with mild interest on everything from the leather embossing to the legibility of the handwriting to speculations about whether magic had been used to pen a few of them, also kept his mind occupied on the task at hand, rather than his apprehension about opening that stone door, or wondering if it would open at all. Every now and again he stumbled across an interesting illustration or some loose leaves within the books that looked as if they may hold some answers, but he was always disappointed. Hundreds of books, he muttered under his breath, sitting down to yet another pile of unread scrolls. The sunset had long ago faded from the sky above the atrium, and a few stars had already begun to appear. He relied on the candlelight to illuminate the pages. There might be at least one with a map. As if in answer, he unfurled one of the larger scrolls. It rolled across the floor and a massive illustration appeared beneath his fingers, inked in black and green. He held his breath, afraid it might vanish from the page, and brushed his fingertips over the ancient markings. It was certainly a map of something. But not, he realized, with a crushing sense of disappointment, Sister's Mountain. It was a seafarer's chart, marking the tides and a wavy coastline that Ember guessed was not too far from the valley, judging by a few of the nearby towns and cities. He recognized some of the symbols from a similar parchment which a grizzled traveler had brought to Ember's small town long ago, but could not recall what any of them meant. Though the memory itself conjured impressions of pipe smoke, a whiff of salt in the air, and a roaring fire in the tavern. Still, where there was one map, there might be more. Eagerly reaching for another scroll, Ember unraveled it and was met with a chart from a different coastline littered with names he could not pronounce, and the next seemed to be a map of the valley and the surrounding lands, but not the inside of the mountain. The fourth concealed several elaborate landscape portraits. One resembled the walking path near the river, though it seemed both more and less overgrown in places. A few were of the surrounding mountains, and one depicted a great body of water with only a small spit of land and wind-tossed trees for reference. He touched the blue and green paint stains, swallowing tightly as the water seemed to roll beneath his hand. It reminded him of Kentucky's living story, and the tales of weathered mariners, so brilliantly that he knew at once it must be the ocean. An endless river, Hunter had once said. Too deep to fathom, too wide to swim across. A place for fools in tall-masted ships to prove their bravery. For there be no master of the seas among us, boy, and the storm cloud answers to no mortal man. Where wind and water meet, ha! There is no wilder and more deadly beauty than that. Have you ever been to sea? Asked Ember, fancying his own future to be full of similar tales. The notion had made him stand very tall indeed, though at that time he was still a good bit shorter than the wayfarer. Long, long ago, and all the wagon teams in your little valley couldn't drag me back again. Heed my warning, Ember, and stay on dry land. The ocean is a tricky thing. And Hunter patted his barrel-faced horse on the neck as it nuzzled his pockets expectantly. Best admired from a distance. Well, thought Ember, he had his adventure now. And he didn't feel nearly so brave nor so competent as his younger self had imagined. One last scroll waited at the bottom of the pile, small, and somewhat tattered. Keeping his hopes reined tightly in, Ember set it on the ground to have a closer look. He grinned. The trail that led up to the sisters was plainly marked, and it did not take him long to find the door by which he and the siren had entered, Vale Gate. An endless maze of twisting corridors and carefully ordered rooms had been drawn within, and the writing was so small it was illegible in places. The topmost portion of the mountain kingdom was labeled Northall, and the lower portion Southall. He held his finger over the corridor they had traversed beyond the door, grand in person, but negligible compared to the scale of the mountain itself, and the strange room where they had found the book. Hall of Justice, proclaimed the scroll. Ember's jaw tightened and he narrowed his eyes at the word, thinking of the sword of justice which had so recently been doled out there by the rotting magic. Beyond that he did not know where he had wandered, for there were many residencies marked out, but it did not take him long to spot a hallway labeled Reflection. The Hall of Mirrors. And there was the room which had given him shelter, the Oracle's sanctuary. The longer he examined the map, the more confused he became, but after tracing and retracing the paths with one finger, he thought he had finally found a way out, if magic had not sealed it off. Vale Gate was, apparently, the southern entrance. For there was another to the north which read, Plains Gate. Shattered Trail Part 2. Ember had heard there were forests on the other side of Sisters Mountain, but at the time when this map had been penned it very well could have been a stretch of flat land. So many years had passed that he would have believed just about anything to have been true at the time, although this brought with it the nagging idea that things must also have changed within the mountain itself. This map could just as well be their downfall as their salvation. Chin up, Ember. One thing at a time. You haven't found her, yet. What if he never did? Supposing he had to find his way out alone? Suppose, Ember rolled up the scroll, hurriedly stood, and darted back into the bedroom. He took the blanket from the bed and spread it out on the flagstones. It's stained and ruined anyway, he thought, struggling to justify what he was doing. He only knew that he had to, and he had nothing else with which to carry these things. He had already decided to take what he could from the corpses outside the sanctuary, if there were any serviceable items to be found, but for now. He plopped down the scroll, and then snatched all 5 fruits from the vines. One of them he saved out for an evening meal, but the rest he set upon the blanket. Then he stalked out of the bedroom and took hold of the largest crystal which grew sideways out of the rock. He tugged on it, trying to make it break free of its cluster, but it refused to give way. "Please," he whispered. "There's someone else who needs it more than I do. I'm going to take it to them, I promise." Another tug. It would not yield. The oracles harvested them regularly. Ember jumped, startled by the lady's voice. She stood across the stream near the door, hands clasped, serene. "They are fragile, and cannot live long apart from this room and the sunlight, but there are a few enchantments which may be used to preserve them." Suspicious, Ember remained where he was. The sudden counsel seemed insincere after her earlier tirade, but the complete annihilation of everyone she had been designed to serve was, he reflected, no doubt a very harsh truth to be told after so many years of hopeful waiting. Nor have I been an entirely inoffensive guest. How can I? Only the oracles were skilled enough to preserve the crystals. Of course, Ember muttered, glowering across the stream. Not that he thought he could do any shaping of magic himself, but a part of him had been hoping for a quick rhyme or a simple word which might shake them loose. His next thought was to do himself a minor harm and hope that one of the crystals came to his aid. If he dropped it into the blanket before it could heal him and hurried on his way, he might find Kentucky Flea before it wilted, or vanished, or whatever happened to crystals when they left this room. But before he could decide whether to act upon this idea, the lady pointed to one of the baskets on the upper shelf of a bookcase. "You may take one for your friend." Ember rushed to the shelf, tipped the basket toward himself, and looked inside. Only 2 smallish crystals remained, a bit of ordinary rock still clinging to their surface. They had been chipped away from the mountain, but not polished. "Oh." He tried very hard not to sound disappointed. "Is this all?" She eyed him unsympathetically. "If you speak the truth, only one is needed." Ember shuddered, the thin scars on his back pulling tight. "I'd like to have them both," he confessed. "If I find someone else who needs it, I can give one to him, or her." The lady was silent for a long while. At last she said, "If you wish to take them both, I cannot stop you. Only know that these stones will not take kindly to misuse." Without a moment's hesitation, he gathered them both very carefully into his hands and carted them back to the bedroom, arranging the fruit, the stone light, and the crystals inside the blanket. The scroll was tucked in last of all. When everything was neatly bundled, he glanced hungrily at the pitcher where it rested on the washstand. "Its source is bound to this room," said the lady, her voice softening. "It will be useless to you. But I have considered your plight, and I do not think any of the oracles I have served would begrudge you the map of the mountain." He blinked, surprised. "Thank you. I have come to an understanding with the information you gave me, and the darkness which followed you here lends credence to your words. When you commanded the door to open, The spells of protection which were wrought about this sanctuary shattered. I sense much magic stirring in the halls beyond my borders, and no sons of men to shape it. However, my offer remains. You may stay in this sanctuary as long as you wish, whether it be a few days more or to live out your days in full." Ember shrugged, listless at the thought. "I appreciate your generosity, but I'll be leaving just the same." He crossed the stream slowly, stomach nodding as he anticipated what might await him on the other side of the door. "I am sorry, you know. About everything." When he glanced over his shoulder, the lady stepped forward, her appearance more ghostly than ever among the twinkling candles. She blinked and wrapped her arms around her ribs, a curious gesture he had not yet seen from her. "That map you carry with you?" "Yes." He tightened his grip on the bundle, protectively. "I have decided that it is my favorite." For a moment, he was at a loss. "What makes you say that?" "You asked me which of these books and scrolls I preferred, when you arrived here. I did not understand your meaning then. Now, I have decided that I prefer that which has brought hope to the last of our children." A knot formed in the back of his throat. "The last of our children." It was penned by an oracle no older than yourself, and it was the final scroll which he added to our collection, before the war began. "It pleases me that his work will be of service to you." Ember hesitated, an idea excitedly rising in his mind. "If there's nothing left here for you anyway, couldn't you accompany me?" A subdued smile touched her lips. "I regret that I must decline, for I cannot stray from this place." "Why is that?" Her eyes unfocused and she flickered faintly. "Like the basin and the pitcher, my source is bound to this room. If I leave here, the weaving will unravel." Ember's heart sank. "Have you ever tried?" She tilted her head. "Does one have to tempt what one already knows to be true?" He didn't agree, but he wasn't going to waste more time arguing with the lady. "Before I go, I was wondering, do you have a name?" Each oracle referred to me in their own way. There are no more oracles here. As such, you may address me in whatever way you would prefer. Ember hesitated, shouldering the blanket and gazing at her for a quiet moment. It might be the closest he would ever come to a face-to-face encounter with another like himself within the mountain, and the thought of leaving pained him more than it should. The water trickled behind her radiant form, awash in moonlight, and the only other sound was his breathing echoing in the room. "My name is Ember," he admitted, compelled to say the words without even knowing why. It was a fool thing to do. But he couldn't leave her there without something human. The lady smiled at him, and crossed the remainder of the space between them on bare and silent feet. "Then go along your way, Ember of the Lost. May the Way-Shaper light your path. The blessing of the oracles goes with you." She placed her shining hands to either side of his face and leaned down. He couldn't feel her touch, but an unexpected warmth was kindled in his chest. He shivered and closed his eyes, taking a deep breath of the cool dusty air. "Thank you, madam," he muttered, somewhat embarrassed. When he opened his eyes, she was gone. Drawing the worn hunting knife from his belt and wishing for the familiar weight of his fishing spear instead, Ember turned to the great stone door and said, "Open." For an awkward and terrifying instant he thought nothing would happen. Then a tremendous scraping, groaning sound shuddered through the room, making all the candles dance under the stars, and the door rolled back very slowly. Ember crouched, clenching the knife, but nothing jumped out at him, only a sea of broken mirrors and a dim light lay beyond. And a long dark corridor, the sight of which brought back every twinge of rent flesh. Ember set one foot on the shards and glanced down briefly. 100 shattered eyes stared back. "Close," he murmured. And the door rolled shut behind him. Each step crunched and reverberated around the hall, and he cringed often, hoping nothing was alerted to his presence. It had been a harrowing ordeal to enter the mountain with Kentucky, and to wander the halls in a dreamlike haze, but this total isolation and clarity of mind left him vulnerable to fears of the wildest sort. Only when he had reached the end of the Hall of Mirrors did he realize just how easy it would be to track the Sirena. A trail of bloody footprints speckled the tiles, so scattered and so messily imprinted that Ember knew at once she must have been sprinting, a dead run, as if there were wolves behind her. Whether haunted by more magic or the relentless pursuit of her own conscience would remain a mystery until they met again. For his own sake, he hoped it was the latter. Chapter 25. As Ember had suspected, the map was a treasure in its own right. The markings gave him a reasonable grasp of his location, which freed him to wander whither he pleased. He chose to leave the trail of speckled footprints behind, for they leapt off down a winding corridor, and instead made his way toward the grand central hall in search of sustenance. It was impossible to count the hours which passed, but he guessed it had been little more than half a day's walk to make his way back to the kitchens. Ember scrounged through the refuse until he located a dusty flask, and sat a long while with it near a puddle of water. He didn't trust any source which flowed along the ground or wound from the direction of the tainted well, but this was a slow trickle which leaked through a crack in the ceiling. He crouched on the stone and waited for the flask to brim, wondering where the drops were dripping from. Perhaps a cistern full of bloated rot corpses. "You really ought to tame your thoughts, Ember," he lectured himself, not for the first time. Anyway, even supposing they were true, he desperately needed a drink, and so would the Sirena, when he found her. If he found her. Strange to think I heard another Sirena singing, back in the sister's footstool. Not long ago I would have sworn the river folk were a fanciful tale spun by those old gossips, and now I've gone and met two of them. His thoughts wandered back to Syl and her wicked smirk. He didn't like how close she had been, nor the idea that she may have glimpsed him through the vision. He suspected she had been nearby when he shattered the bone. Had her magic been tangled up with that of the mountain? Did she know what he looked like, now? There seemed no explanation for the occurrence, but he wondered if perhaps the well had been used to contact other oracles. She must have been tailing Kentucky this whole time. Did Kentucky know she was being followed? How long did it take Syl to track her down? Of one thing he was convinced, he had come terrifyingly close to meeting the same gruesome end as the ill-fated Bren that day. Indeed, he surely would have, if Kentucky had not found him so swiftly. Her impatience with his fumbling translation at the door must have been fraught with no small measure of fear, knowing that her sister was once more so close to fouling her plans. And what were those plans? She had never told him plainly, and the implications of that were rather disquieting. "I'll simply ask, of course, when next our paths cross," he decided, shaking the excess water from the flask and lifting it to his lips. "Supposing I don't die of drinking poisoned water first." But no cramps or ominous aches beset him as he sought out the place where Kentucky had flung his fishing spear. It was not far from where he thought it might be, and he settled it gratefully upon his shoulder once more, relieved by the familiar weight of it. It was a foolish comfort, perhaps. Surely such a crude implement would be of little use if it came to blows with an angry Sirena, or anything else which may yet lurk beneath the mountain. Thusly armed, he returned to the trail of siren blood. It was almost too easy to pick up Kentucky's tracks, such that for the first hour or two, he braced himself for an ambush. The corridor dimmed, and misplaced objects caught his eye now and then in the shadows, bits of ribbon or torn fabric, an empty jar, an arrowhead burrowed into the stony wall or a dagger on the floor. None of these things turned him from his course. Until he encountered human bones. Kentucky's footprints ended abruptly, as if she had taken a leap, and reappeared opposite the remains, continuing at a frantic pace down the hall. But Ember knelt beside the dead and held forth the stone light curiously. "What happened here?" he murmured, squinting in the darkness. His breath stirred a faint puff of dust, and he coughed. The corpse was bedecked in rusted armor. Guard, warrior, or soldier of some sort. He could just make out an emblazoned symbol on the breastplate, which appeared to be a rising sun. Beneath it, a glyph which resembled a skewed, wind peaks, one slightly higher than the other. He traced the design with his fingers. Sister's Mountain. Strangely, though he glanced about the hallway, there was no skull to be seen. A helmet lay upon the stone, empty. He could not fathom why the head had been confiscated, and not else. Perhaps a dreadful trophy. After a moment of silent respect, he rose to his feet and dusted off his hands. A glimmer of blue caught his eye. He turned his head sharply, snatching his spear. There, in the corner, another pile of bones. This corpse slumped against the ramshackle barricade, and its head was still attached. He took a cautious step in that direction, casting the golden stone light upon it. Cobwebs trailed through its empty rib cage, and bony claws grasped the hilt of a shining short sword upon which it had impaled itself. A siren, he thought, noting the gaping jaw and pointed teeth. It must have slain the warrior. But there was something rather haunting about the way in which it had fallen against the wall. Had the creature bested its mortal foe, only to then take its own life with this blade? If so, why? Regret, perhaps? Ember scoffed under his breath, shook his head, and reached for the hilt. A serene blue light sparked along the blade, and it buzzed like a singing bee. He gasped faintly, jerking his hand away. The runes faded, for that is what they were. A word had been etched into the fuller. He hesitated, and then reached for it again. The buzz returned, a pleasant humming sound, and the glow intensified. Ember was no weaponsmith, but the beauty of the sword spoke for itself. The diamond-shaped pommel was set with a glassy stone, and an elegant cross-guard had been expertly fashioned into a pair of triangular spines which pointed at its most recent adversary like two silver fangs. He impulsively grasped the elegant hilt, closing his fingers around the cold metal. It warmed beneath his touch. Ember yanked it free. The bones rattled together and the skeleton slid down along the wall, but Ember paid it no heed, captivated by the blade in his hand. He swung it once, dust and cobwebs flying, and almost laughed. Light as a feather. He hefted the blade, and then set about determining which of the corpses it had belonged to. A leather belt and a fine wrapped scabbard were easily procured, preserved by some enchantment or other, and he shook them vigorously to loosen the dust and debris. The buckle had to be fastened several notches tighter, but once Ember finished adjusting the length of it, the belt nestled nicely beneath his fishing spear. Before he strapped the short sword to his back, he ran a finger along the polished steel to admire the runes. It took him only a moment to piece them together, although some were oddly shaped. They read, more or less, Fishbitter. He mouthed the word, and then smiled to himself. Fishbitter. An apt name for such a weapon. He closed his fist around the hilt with a sudden resolve. It is a rare pleasure to make your acquaintance, Fishbitter, he said formally. And then blushed a little at his own foolishness. My name is Ember Jarlson, and I do promise to wield you bravely. Though I confess I have never touched a weapon so fine in all my days. As he spoke, the filigree shimmered along the length of the runes, and Fishbitter hummed. Only once the spark of blue had reached the end of the etchings did the weapon fall dark and quiet once more. He couldn't shake the feeling that the sword had returned his greeting. Ember yawned, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand. The tracks had become messier and blotchier as Kentucky's frenetic pace increased, and he could tell she had been favoring one foot more than the other from the way the blood had spattered. At last he encountered a grim pool of it. He crouched with a sympathetic wince, tapping the stone floor with a finger. It was still somewhat tacky, and beside the congealed blood glinted a pile of splintered glass, most of it crusted in crimson. I'm sorry, Kentucky. It was more an acknowledgment than apology. The notion of yanking those glittering shards from the pads of his own bare feet prompted a shiver of disgust. From there the bloody tracks became fainter and fainter, until there were only a few drops of red to guide him, and he feared he might lose her path altogether. He stifled another yawn and leaned against the wall to steady himself. The prospect of falling asleep alone outside the Oracle's sanctuary was not an appealing one, but having the sword at his side did lend him a bit of courage. Besides, what else was there to do? He was so tired that he knew he would drift off sooner or later, regardless. I can rest for a moment, anyway, he sighed, eyelids fluttering as he sank to the floor. Too tired to walk much further. His voice echoed pleasantly around him. The empty corridor faded. And Ember wandered alone in a misty wood. Chapter 26 Touch of the Other. The trees were tall, slender and black. It reminded him of the tainted forest above Sister's footstool, and something else was wrong about it aside from the forlorn appearance, though he couldn't name it. The absence of something. Something important. He strolled past willowy trunks and drooping leaves, passing his hand across the living deadness of the cold bark, and shivered. No sound. There should be bird calls in a forest of this size, but he could hear not one. It was a world devoid of comings and goings, of rustling, flapping, twittering, scurrying. The entire woodland held its breath, even his footsteps muffled by loamy earth. Where am I, and why am I here? He knew that it was a passing dream, though in all his life he had never dreamt of a stillness such as this. He was aware that he slept, even as the bark texture crumbled away beneath his fingertips, like ash from a burnt-out coal. Yet the notion of wandering until he waked had no appeal. So he stopped, taking a deep breath of sodden air and staring at the motionless mist. As if prompted by his shift in mood, a breeze whispered through the trees, disturbing the mist and hinting at a shadow beyond his sight. He remained still and silent, filled with wondrous dread as a familiar figure stepped forth, elegantly pulling a reddish wave of hair over her shoulder and letting it trail down to her ankles. She stood tall before him, naked and shining in the light which came from nowhere, mouth curling into a toothy artifice of a smile. "Hello, man." Ember swallowed hard, keeping his hand on the tree. It was then that he realized he had no spear, no armament. Only the clothes on his back. "Hello, witch." Syl pursed her lips, black eyes sparkling, not displeased with the name. He noted a dampness at the corners of her mouth, but before he could quite comprehend it, her tongue flickered out and it was gone. She flared her nostrils twice, sniffing silently. "And for what purpose are you wandering here?" He paused, stricken by the resonance of her voice. She spoke as deftly as one of the townsfolk from his humble valley, though her words were more enunciated, and echoed forth with more commanding clarity. She lingered on each syllable, winding them round her tongue to taste their essence before they left her ruddy lips. Yet there was a peculiarity to those words, an accent which he could not place, which turned this common speech into something of the otherworldly. "I could ask the same of you," he answered at last. Syl grinned, fangs glimmering. "I love it," she crooned, "when men pretend they are clever." His heart pounded, and he slowly hogged himself, digging his nails into his arms in hopes that the pinching sensation would awaken him. But nothing changed. "And you think you are, is that it? This is clever, whatever you're doing here?" He tightened his grip and gritted his teeth. "Leave me alone. I don't want to speak with you. This is only a twisted nightmare. You can't forget what you saw in the Oracle's sanctuary, and that is all there is to it. 'Tis you who summoned me, is it not?" Syl spread out her arms, sauntering another step. "Well met, young one. Ne'er has the daughter of Clan Vlee beheld such power in a mortal thing, least of all a mere boy. Perhaps it is she who is at your bidding." His face flushed at her implication. The taunt brought a tangle of emotions to the surface, indignation, loathing, and a hint of desire. Yet at the word boy he caught a faint twitch of her upper lip. Derision. But her remarks had given him a measure of courage. If he held the power, he could make her go away. Were they still linked through the well somehow, or was she towering over him even now, weaving her siren enchantments about his unconscious mind? Could it be another trick, more mountain magic, like the Book of Echoes? "Now, that I very much doubt," Ember couldn't help muttering. Her lip curled fully. "You never did tell me your name, did you?" His heart pounded. "Maybe this isn't a dream. My name. When I asked you, before, is that why you have summoned me here? For a meeting proper?" Syl relieved him of her sultry stare and cast her glance around the mist, inky eyes flitting from tree to tree. "There are some things sacred among all living beings, not least of which is this. If I am telling you my name, then you are bound to tell me yours." Her casual disinterest disturbed him. For all her empty flattery, it left the impression that she had no concern of anything which he might do, and he supposed, were he a Serena with a world of sound and magic at his bidding, then he would not fear Ember Jarlson either. If there was even the faintest chance that Ember could cast her out of his mind, he decided it must be attempted, and the sooner the better. So he closed his eyes, thinking as hard as he could about nothing at all. "This is my dream," he declared very firmly. "And you aren't in it." A cold breath chilled his face, and she chuckled, a whispering sound, like water tumbling over stones in the autumn. "Am I not?" Ember turned and ran, faster, further, stumbling downhill, surrounded by the deadness of his own waking dream. But he had not gone more than a handful of paces before he tripped, pitching forward with a strangled cry and falling to the forest floor. A chortle of laughter floated through the silent woods. "Wake up," he huffed. "Wake up, wake up. Why do you run from me, boy?" came the fair, fell voice. "Or have you no real power after all? How disappointing that would be." The obscuring mist rolled slowly away before her lullaby tones, refusing to hide his shaking form. Shuffling leaves and moss whispered behind him. "Wake up." He pinched himself desperately, smacked his face, scraped and clawed at the loamy soil. "Where have you hidden the dark-haired one?" A chill finger trailed the nape of his neck. "Ah!" Ember yanked upright, fingers clasped around cold metal. Sweat rolled down his back and dripped between his eyes. A cool blue glow illuminated the blood-spattered corridor, and he saw a silvery rune-etched blade extended before him. Fishbitter. The short sword was clenched in both his hands, trembling like a leaf in the winter. For a moment, Ember remained very still, struggling to understand what had happened. The pool of Kentucky's blood remained as it had been when he had first reclined against the wall, except that it had begun to crack and flick, and Fishbitter's bluish aura glittered upon the reflective shards of glass. No fiend of the deep grinned down at him, ready to devour him whole. Unsatisfied, he glanced about the stone hallway, aiming the sword in every direction. Not until several minutes had ticked by in silence did he exhale, slowly, and draw himself up onto his knees. The sword buzzed faintly and dimmed like a snuffed lamp, plunging him back into the darkness of the mountain. He coughed, swallowing several times and attempting to spit the sour taste from his mouth. "I'm all right," he whispered. "I'm alone. Alone, for the present." But he decided not to dwell upon that thought. "Guess it's just you and me for now, Fishbitter." Ember rose unsteadily to his feet, taking a swig from the flask he had stolen. A drop of water ticked upon the blade and he glanced down at it, wiping an arm across his mouth. He was baffled as to how the sword had ended up in his grasp, or how he had managed not to lop off a limb in his sleep, at that. The trail of fresh blood was getting more difficult to discern among the old stains and dusty debris, but he found, curiously, that if he held out the sword before him, the drops and smudges took on a luminous blue sheen in the glow of the runes. "That's fortunate," he mused. "Thank you for your help." Fishbitter shivered faintly in his grasp with a hum of ringing metal. It almost sounded pleased. Chapter 27 Familiar Voice. Kentucky awoke to the sound of her own wheezing. Hot pain rattled through her ribs, prickling her lungs and drying her mouth and nose. Muffled songs of the living and the dead jabbered through the walls, whispers, taunts, accursed memories. She wished she could unravel each of them one by one, but for all her fevered fancies she knew full well it was beyond her skills to do so, or even to understand the brilliance of those minds which had woven them. Many bent spells, most bent toward one end, and that end was to destroy. Man magic. It was different from her siren song, the clans of the deep-breathed barbarity and chaos, but the enchantments that lingered here had been manifested with intricate patterns and a sense of order which baffled Kentucky. This dark hovel she had found was even smaller than her forgotten friend's nest beside the river. A few carved pieces of wood, probably meant for sitting on, were scattered about, and a large silvery panel on which she could see her own face cringing back at her. She had turned it against the wall. Her beauty had always brought her pleasure, but now she wished never to see her face again, smeared red with his blood. No doubt he had crawled away somewhere to die. Forget. Kentucky reached down to touch the sole of her left foot, and hissed. Still oozing. She had plucked out most of the shards, but they would not heal, no matter how she cajoled them. Something in the stagnant air, perhaps. Snail skin, the book had called her. It had not even the courtesy of choosing an ill-fitting taunt. Yes. She would always be a snail skin. Slimy, slinking, slithering thing. Lives only to feed and be satisfied. Until it grows hungry once more. And then it will feed again. Always hungry. Forever feeding. With a whispering sigh, she removed her fingers from her throbbing feet and resolved to think no more. It was finished. The book had chased him away, And then she had, always hungry, screamed her own echo. Forever feeding. Kentucky pressed shaking fingers to her temples, sticky with gore and sweat. Soon she would wither into a desiccated husk, and join him among the mountain's dead. But to whichever realm of light and laughter his mortal soul had flown, hers could never follow. No, her essence would sink down, down, into the stone below, where she would dwell in darkness for the rest of eternity. It was not the withering itself which terrified her, but the thought of the nothingness, of perfect isolation. Yet whoever had dwelt in this nest before the mountain fell to ruin had been resigned, perhaps even pleased, to be alone. The single bed and blanket in the corner, the handful of dusty shells, the ragged animal's skin on the floor, and a few sparse necessities were a testament to simple living. The skin, she knew, was from a fluffy goat. 1,000 years of dust collecting had not entirely removed its scent. A slab of oak hung above the modest alcoves, human glyphs etched into its polished surface. She recognized a few from the door to the mountain and tried to string them together in her head, but soon abandoned that as a futile endeavor. There was no escape from her relentless remorse. She could forget the mist on the water and the sun on her face. She could forget the taste of fresh fish and the smell of salt. But she could not forget him. His ghost, a fleeting shadow in the corner, a half-spoken echo in the air, would not leave her in peace. Nor would the unforgiving stains which lingered in patches on her hands and arms. His song echoed distantly in the halls outside, like the warmth of a drifting memory, though she knew it could not be, knew what she had done in the darkness. Kentucky closed her eyes and took a shallow breath. She would remember his name just once more. She would remember, to forget. I will forget you, Ember. Thump. Kentucky twitched and bared her fangs. The thumping returned to rattle the door, louder and more insistent. There was no other entrance through which she might make her escape. Nor could she run faster or find wounded feet. Ember's song was louder now, and she could hear the rapid rhythm of his pounding heart. A muffled voice reached her ears. I know you're in there. Pale golden light seeped through the crack at the bottom of the door, casting aside the darkness where it touched. One stray flicker fell over Kentucky's leg and she yanked it away, disturbed by the sudden light. Hello? Asked the voice, less sure of itself than before. The wooden latch creaked slightly, and lifted. Kentucky shivered. More tricks? It's Ember. I'm coming in. I'm not here to hurt you. You don't have to be afraid of me. The statements were quick, a rehearsed speech. Then, more boldly, and I'm not afraid of you, either. The door opened. First the hand, somewhat scuffed around the knuckles, and then an arm as the door swung inward. Then his head came into view, Ember, as curly and bright-eyed as ever. But there was something wrong with his face. It was taut, and whitish, and the skin looked bruised and strangely thin, as if held together by strength of will alone. His eyes found her in the shadows. They didn't meet her gaze, but rather traveled briefly across her face and glanced over the rest of the little room. The pale light of the stone, which he had cleverly attached to his belt with a bit of fraying rope, cast its rays across his whole figure. Then he stepped in firmly and shut the door with another thump. The silence itself condemned her. His shirt was stained a pinkish color and hung over his frame in miserable tatters instead of sheltering it. But he was not dead, and he was not a trick. He smelled like Ember. It would have to be a very wily spell indeed to impersonate his scent, any scent, well enough to fool Kively. He stooped slightly, and now she could see that he had many things to weigh him down. 3 leather straps spanned his chest, one of them belonging to a sword hilt that stuck up over his right shoulder, and other items had been strapped onto what seemed to be a bulky pack. The pack hung over the sword, rendering it useless, but he gripped his familiar fishing spear in his right hand. She opened her mouth to speak, but only managed a faint whistling breath. Her lips cracked, and she swallowed loudly. Well, then, he said, as if they had only parted a moment ago, and he knelt before her on the sheepskin. He removed the glowing stone from his belt, set it between them on the floor, and then began to shed the rest of the items he had carted there. First he propped his fishing spear against the wall behind him. Foolish, Foolish, and then he removed the leather pack from his shoulders. Odds and ends he had accumulated dangled from the straps and pockets, and among them Kentucky spotted 2 bundles of dried herbs and a flask. Her throat squeezed, a sticky noise of longing which made Ember glance up very suddenly. His hand shook on the leather strap. Here, he grabbed the flask, offering it to her somewhat unsteadily. Be careful where you drink water here. I found some. Kentucky snatched it, bashing the cork off with the palm of her hand and tipping her chin back, a stream of water flooding out of the flask and filling her mouth. A burst of cool wetness made her tremble, and she let out a helpless cry of joy and relief at the touch of it. All her dreams had been of water, all her hopes and wishes, water, and here the man had returned from the dead and brought water with him. If she were in the grip of magic, caught in another dream, a song trap, then here she would gladly stay. It could do as it wished with her, for it knew the 2 things she wanted above all else and had played her well. Gasping, Kentucky shook the flask, flinging the remaining droplets over her bare face, arms, and legs and rubbing the coveted moisture into her dry, cracked skin. I found some that was poisoned, Ember finished, looking rather bashful. Kentucky froze, water dripping off the end of her nose. Poison. Revenge. That is why he comes. Revenge. It's all right. This is from the kitchens, he explained quickly. Kitchens? The poisoned water came out of the well and this was dripping down from above, someplace. I don't know how to tell if it's safe, but I drank some and I haven't died. He scoffed faintly. Yet. As the empty flask fell from her hands, Ember reached into one of the leather pockets for something small and glistening. Here, he offered again, holding it out to her. Kentucky glowered, suspicion lingering. What is it? She whispered, finally finding her voice. Blinking, Ember set it on the ground in front of her. It will make your pain go away. The crystal appeared innocuous, but Kentucky would not be duped a second time. You know this? She murmured, poking it with a claw. You are certain? Nothing is for certain here, is it? He gave a short laugh that didn't sound mirthful in the least. I mean, I'm not even certain, hear you? He finted forward slightly, and then withdrew. They eyed one another for several moments before his gaze wandered back to the door. The silence allowed her to hear a faint song. Pleasing, gentle, soft. The crystal. Kentucky touched it, solace. Gasping great draughts of air, she clutched it to her face, her chest, and then pressed her hands, brimming with swirling dust the color of the sea on a sunlit morning, to the pads of her feet. The searing anguish lifted from her body, as if a great fog had rolled away, and she could now see clearly what she had only thought she was seeing before. She blinked several times as Ember's face came into view again, beyond the melting pain. He sat cross-legged on the goatskin, watching her intensely. He did not smile. Kentucky dropped her gaze and focused her attention on the glowing stone instead, plucking at the net which bound it and stroking her thumbs across the ridged surface. Its familiar song brought memories of hillsides, daylight, and dark wooded trees. Why did you bring me here? Even as he spoke the words, Kentucky tightened her lips, clutching that pearl of knowledge into herself. Clamped, unyielding. That pearl was not for Ember. It was a secret she herself did not fully understand. Known only to one other amongst her kin, and his skull had been crushed, his body torn, and his entrails eaten by fishes long ago. She indulged in a comforting hum. A weary sigh shivered the air in front of her face as Ember settled into a comfortable position. She curled her lip into nods. He was prepared to wait her out. It wasn't just to open the door in the mountain, was it? The sleepy stone blinked. She held it up to her nose, watching the misty glow twirl within. I think I deserve to know. Don't you? Kentucky blew on its golden surface, a fresh light warming their little nest. You can tell me anything, Kentucky. I'm not going to leave, I promise. After some thought, she let the stone come to rest in her lap, cradling it in both hands. The light flickered for a moment, the dance slowing. We should not be here. I wish we are going away from this place. Darker, dimmer. She closed her hands over it, unsettled. I found something that might help with that. Something clinked softly, and when Kentucky looked up she was surprised to see Ember digging through the pack. He pulled out a few mushy-looking fruits and rolled one across the floor to her. Kentucky snatched it and devoured it with hardly a second thought. While she was still wiping the flavorful juice from her face, he threw something else at her. It hit the ground with a dull rustle. A little scroll. Kentucky jerked against the wall. "Why do you bring this here?" she accused stiffly. Take it away." "Look here," Ember muttered impatiently. "This is our way out." She eyed the scroll warily as he rolled it open on the floor, but there was no echo, no enchantment. A map rested beneath his dirty fingers, slightly tattered but legible. He tapped the upper corner of the page and announced, "Another gate." Kentucky leaned forward, interested in spite of herself. "I cannot read these runes." "Have you seen a map before?" he inquired earnestly. She offered him a sidelong stare. Clearing his throat awkwardly, Ember shuffled around so that he was sitting almost next to her, and turned the map so that it was facing them properly. "Best I can make out. This is the gate where we came in. Vale Gate, I think it's called. We are here, in Southall, I think, where all these little rooms are, so we'd have to travel from here to here." He pointed as he spoke. "The sisters have been abandoned for hundreds of years, so I'm sure a few of these paths are impassable, but if we keep to the middle of the map, we should find that other gate sooner or later. Right?" Kentucky quietly drank in the ink with her eyes, committing every line and unfamiliar rune to memory. "Ember," she said, allowing herself to enjoy the melody of that name, a melody which she had so recently resolved to forget. "That gate is far from us. So we simply start walking and see how long it takes." He flattened his hand over the map, squinting down at it. "What other choice do we have? Unless you want to try getting out the way we came in, but that voice I heard in the woods, I mean," he glanced up and down again, unusually bashful. "Well, whatever that was, it might find us if we go back." She winced, digging her claws into her knees. "Yes. Here, at least, we are safe from the dangers outside this mountain. And if we are bespelled again? How then shall we fare?" "Well," Ember said, more darkly than she had expected, "I don't know. Why don't you start by telling me why you came here to begin with?" And Kentucky knew at once that she had not heard the last of this. "That is no meaning now," she coughed, looking away. "Think, Ember, we will meet more tricky magic, yes? What then?" Ember tried to catch her gaze again. When it became clear that she would not answer him, he swore under his breath and scratched his head, fingers lost in a tangle of blunt curls. "We won't be so easily taken in again. If we are, we will tear each other apart." He inhaled, worry flitting across his face, and reached back slightly with one hand. Then he clenched his fist. "I was going to say that if we are, it won't be in the same way. We must be more careful about what we touch or look at." He waited for a response, and the lull gave Kentucky time to notice that the jabbering voices had softened. Rather than being drawn to Ember, they seemed repelled, or at the very least stifled by his presence. She was suddenly tempted to reach out and touch him, to assure herself of his materiality. "There are too many songs here, Ember," she whispered instead, chewing one of her claws anxiously. "Too many spells, and I cannot untangle them." "I know," said Ember unexpectedly. "Will you come with me?" Kentucky flinched. The kindest thing to do would be to walk away, for his own sake. "But I am not kind," she sighed. "I am very selfish." She had her Ember again. Her hunger was sated, for now. "Perhaps, if, after all of this, you still think of me as friend, then I can find no reasoning with which to disagree." Ember stood, showing his teeth in a slivered grin. He retrieved his fishing spear and hefted it once, his other hand drifting upward to the gleaming hilt of the sword, though not in such a way as to draw it from its shell. A fingertip brushed the silver-bound pommel, and she wondered fleetingly if its touch reassured him. His blue eyes glimmered. "You won't regret this." "But you will." Kentucky smiled, the corners of her mouth pulling thin, and held out her hand. Ember grasped it firmly. Chapter 28 Regrets. The sword and pack weighed heavily on Ember's shoulders as he shut the oaken door with a gentle thud. Kentucky stood aside, shoulders hunched with an unusual meanness, or weakness, that tugged at his heart. He wondered how much blood she had lost. His physical burden was no less ponderous than that of Kentucky's presence and the unanswered question he would have to ask again, soon, if he was to restore any peace of mind where the Serena was concerned. But above all he was conscious of the thin, pale lines on her face. Like tear tracks. All that was left of his foolish mistake. He wondered how long it would take them to fade. Would they ever? He rolled his shoulders, feeling his own newly healed muscles stretch and tighten. She offered a faint smile, the twin scars crinkling around her eyes and the corners of her mouth, and he glanced away quickly, searching for a distraction and finding nothing that hadn't been there when he first entered the maze of dwellings. Although Ember shivered. There was a draft. That was new. It had always been cool under the mountain, but this was different, an icy coldness which wafted down the hall at regular intervals like the breath of a frosty giant. Whatever its source, it was not the direction in which they were bound, and it made him even more anxious to leave. Without another word, Ember set off down the row of open doorways, and Kentucky gingerly stalked after him. He kept 2 arm lengths between himself and the Serena, and carried his spear between them as well, swinging it as he walked. Thus they continued in much the same way they had ascended the sister's footstool. The only marked difference was the pervasive silence. Kentucky did not hum at all, but cast quick, nervous glances into the darkest corners, and Ember was biding his time, rephrasing that singular burning question in his mind over and over until he was sure she could not help but give him an honest answer. Her familiar scent lured him into a strange calm, which he found even more unsettling than the terror he had experienced while approaching the little door, not knowing what awaited him behind it. His only real comfort was the spare crystal hidden under his belt, and the sword slung across his back. It was short, able to be drawn not elegantly but with little difficulty from that position after he'd made several tries at it. It had struck him at the time as a pleasing thing to have, and having no fangs or claws himself he thought fish butter a clever name for a clever weapon, but now it seemed an almost arcane thing to be carrying in Kentucky's presence. Until he had desperate need of it, in the scabbard it would stay. "What do the runes say?" He stumbled, missing a stride, before remembering what she meant. "Back there, in the cavern? You mean that oak branch?" "Yes." He rolled his eyes back in his head, grateful for the distraction. "Contentment, I think." She padded silently across the hall for a moment. "I am not knowing that word." Another moment passed before she ventured, "It is." "Pleased, yes?" Ember considered it. "I suppose it means to be happy with who you are, and where you are, and what you have, even if you're nobody at all, and you've no home nor any belongings to speak of." "Ah." Her voice lilted downward, like a weary bird. She hopped once to match their strides and sidled closer, black hair swaying about her face. Then she looked up at him again, eyes glimmering green around the edges in the light of the stone. "As you were, in your nest." An old memory resurfaced and he broke away from her stare with an inward wince, bouncing his spear in his hand. He felt dishonest, but was compelled to nod absently. "Have I ever been content? Maybe once, long ago, when his little family lived together. After his sister had married off, the cabin had lost some of its charm. 'Tis not the hearth which makes a home," Isabel had confided. It had been an early spring morning, and they stood together in the chilly dew beside a freshly dug grave which lay in wait for his mother's lifeless body. She had been a source of hard-edged comfort to Ember. Her youthful words were honest, and colder for it, but never cross or bitter. It's the folk that dwell within those walls. They are the ones who make your hearth a happy place to be. Remember that, Ember. You can choose your family, now. Choose wisely. Yes. As I was. He left it at that, lost in the memories of his early childhood. As he thought of his sister, his focus drifted to the vision the well had offered him, and the recent nightmare which still seemed all too real. He dared not inquire about the unfortunate Bren or Kentucky's intentions toward him, but he seized upon what seemed a canny way to draw her out of her shell again, and perhaps arrive at an understanding of whether he had indeed encountered the real Syl in his waking nightmare. I lived with my sister, until she went away. Do you have a sister? She looked at him sharply and stopped working, her neck rigid and her hands deceptively soft. Ember stopped as well. Fishbutter grew heavier, it seemed, and the leather strap dug into his shoulder. He cleared his throat and adjusted the belt, shifting his weight to the other foot. He had been too forward, too obvious. Did she know what he had seen? How could she? She couldn't. But perhaps she suspected something, or perhaps the mere thought of her sister was enough to elicit such a reaction. Fool! What for do you ask me this? She demanded, plucking at a loose thread on her jerkin. Her lower left eyelid twitched up slightly. Nothing, really. My sister left a long time ago. Married some cadger from Ridgeville. He fumbled for words. I just wondered. Kentucky stared at him like that for several moments more before resuming her slinking stride. Yes. I have a sister. Letting out the breath he had been holding, Ember decided it was safe to pursue the topic a bit further. Does she look like you? No. He knew that already, but he didn't want to divulge anything he had seen. It gave him a way to judge how honest her answers were. What's her name? Why are you wanting to know these things? Hedged Kentucky, her voice creeping closer to that sulking whine he had heard in the Wells vision. What are they worth to you? Ember shrugged. He had no wish to torment her, but he was resolved to get the information he wanted one way or another, and she refused to answer him directly. Unless you'd rather discuss why, exactly, you wanted me to open the door in the mountain. Sylvie. Kively and Sylvie? Yes. Vli is our clan name. Kentucky seemed more comfortable with this new line of conversation. Sylvie is always wanting more. More pretty things, more magic. She is wanting to become the leader of our clan. And when I see her last, she is ascending to the circle of 7. Ember fell silent. There was a certain wistfulness to Kentucky's voice which caught him off guard. And do you think she will become the leader of your clan, someday? If she wishes it. Kentucky chewed the inside of her cheek. Whatever she wishes for. It is always hers, in the end. What does Vli mean? He asked more softly. Fish. That's your clan name? Ember hid a smile, but it faded quickly as he recalled the runes upon the blade he carried. Fish? Yes. She ducked her head. Kentucky means to be little. He couldn't help a short laugh. Little fish. And Syl, then? Kentucky mulled it over for several moments, and then pointed at Ember's shoulder. He frowned, bewildered, until she reached up and tapped the sword hilt with a claw. A clear, pleasant tink echoed off the shattered walls. It is like that, she said cryptically. Silver? Ember guessed, unsure. A thoughtful Shiny, she amended. Beautiful. Like sunlight on water. Ember remembered very vividly just how pleasant Syl's aspect, and how terrifyingly hideous her demeanor, and fought off a shudder. You're beautiful, he protested awkwardly. He was uncertain how else to disagree with the misfit descriptor of a fiend which he had personally encountered, and despised. Kentucky looked away, but he saw her visibly perk up, her flitting hands preening stray locks of hair. Yes, she said. I know. He let the echoes drift for several minutes, pleased with himself for lightening the mood and wondering what he could say that would coax a bit more information from the Serena. Before he could decide what, exactly, that might be, he glimpsed a sudden blur out of the corner of his eye. Kentucky murmured something and Ember readied the spear. Did you see? Flash. A wisp of darkness that flitted from one pillar to the next. Ember's mouth dried out and he fumblingly removed the stone light from his belt, passing it off to the Serena with shaking fingers. She whispered to it and it flared brightly, lighting up another 5 paces of hallway. Echoes and whispers permeated the entire mountain, but this was something new. Flash. Again, just a blur in the darkness. And a faint snuffling, snorting sound, like a pig hunting for truffles or a watchdog's baleful snore. What is that? Ember whispered, shaken. Kentucky shook her head. It was all the answer he needed to begrudgingly sling his familiar spear over his shoulder and draw the ancient sword. It came loose with a rasp and a short, ungainly tug, and he clenched it in his right hand with a grim swallow. The runes flickered at his touch. Her wide eyes glinted at the weapon, and then darted to Ember's face, but although a strained, pale hollowness touched her features, she made no remark. The snuffling faded away soon after, leaving them alone with the dripping echoes until at last Ember concluded that whatever it was had gone. But once they had settled down to rest, Ember with the fishing spear across his knees and Kentucky crouched several paces away, he thought he heard a strange whistling from far off, not quite a voice, though possibly lifted in song. The echoes were too distorted to understand. Against his will they lulled him into a state that resembled peace, and his grasp loosened on the sword. But Kentucky never relaxed. She grew more and more agitated with every soft reverberation, and when at last he settled down against the wall to rest, she remained crouched like a coiled snake ready to strike at the slightest provocation. His last coherent thought was to wonder if sirens ever slept. Ember woke from feverish nightmares to a dry mouth and splitting headache. He was left with only vague impressions of misty trees, clambering up a forested hillside, and the fading silhouette of a womanly figure dripping with river water, but try as he might he could not remember them exactly, they were too hazy. He felt as he were recalling several dreams muddled into one. Kentucky had shifted during his repose to kneel at the foot of a pillar, her head resting against the smooth stone and her eyes roving aimlessly across the hall. When he shifted, she started and glanced up at him. "Hear something?" he asked with a wince, licking his cracked lips. Her ears flickered. "Many things. That thing we saw last night." "No. It has not returned. Are you rested?" Ember shrugged one shoulder, tilting his head back and forth and listening to the bones in his neck pop. "Yes," he said after a moment, scrubbing dried sweat from his forehead. "Are you?" She flicked her fingers, one ear twitching in annoyance. He dug into his pack, looking for the last of the oracle's fruit. Kentucky hummed nervously. His hand encountered nothing but empty leather and a bundle of dried herbs he had ransacked from one of the kitchens, the only edibles which had not already been pilfered, and he had taken only those plants he recognized from his garden and the surrounding woodlands. Thyme, basil, mint, chamomile, borage, and the like. She glanced at an open doorway, drawing her blue tongue once across her lips. "Did you eat it?" No reply. "Kentucky," he mumbled, amused in spite of himself. "If you ate it, you ate it. From now on, though, we share everything." "Yes?" She shifted her stare to the bundle of herbs in his hands, and a pained hunger briefly sharpened her features. Ember's stomach sank. Kentucky, as he had witnessed, was a ravenous creature, always on the brink of starvation if her appetite was to be believed. "It's possible that she needs more food than I do." He knew approximately how long he could forego eating with few ill effects, but his winter fasting had usually been spent sitting huddled in a corner of the bed nook with a blunt needle and thread while cursing and muttering over some new hole he had worn in his trousers, or even lying flat on his back and only stirring to fetch water from the icy river if he had gone several days without sustenance. Never had he attempted walking from sunup till sundown on an empty stomach with only a few short naps to replenish his energy. Sighing, he separated the dried herbs into 2 bunches and offered one to the Serena, keeping the hairy borage leaves and chamomile for himself. The chamomile would calm his nerves, and the village grandmothers insisted that borage gave one courage. Ember had once scoffed at the idea, but it would certainly do him no harm. Kentucky snatched up the herbs without hesitation and crammed them into her mouth. Ember handed her the flask, praying she would not drink it all, but it was still half full when she handed it back. He took a grateful swig. "Shall we go?" The Sirena swallowed and licked her lips once more. "We shall."